The first shot rang out across the Montana prairie, just as the sun began to sink behind the distant mountains. The loud crack shattering the peaceful afternoon as Tessa Nelson clutched the reins of her wagon with white-knuckled hands. It was 1878, and she had never expected to die alone on the trail to Helena, surrounded by 6 armed riders whose intentions were written plainly across their weathered faces. "Hand over everything you got, lady," the leader called out, his voice rough as sandpaper as he leveled his pistol at her chest. "Ain't gonna ask twice." Tessa's heart hammered against her ribs as she assessed her options. The wagon contained everything she owned in the world, including the small pouch of savings meant to start her new life. At 22, she was alone in the world, having buried her father just 2 months prior. The farm in Minnesota had been sold, and now her future rested on reaching Helena where her mother's sister lived. "I have nothing of value," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. The late afternoon light caught on her copper hair, which had fallen loose from its pins during the long day's journey. "Let us be the judge of that," another rider sneered, edging his horse closer. Tessa's hand inched toward the small derringer hidden in the folds of her skirt, a parting gift from her father who had warned her about the dangers of traveling west. But before her fingers could close around the weapon, a shot exploded from the rocky outcropping to her right. One of the bandits jerked backward in his saddle, clutching his shoulder. The others whirled around, confusion evident in their panicked movements. "That's just a warning," a deep voice called out from behind the rocks. "The next one goes through someone's heart." "Now ride away before I change my mind," the bandits hesitated, scanning the terrain, unable to locate the shooter. Another shot kicked up dirt directly in front of the leader's horse, causing it to rear up in fright. "I ain't dying over this," one of the men muttered, wheeling his horse around. The others followed suit, the injured man cursing as they galloped away across the open prairie. Tessa sat frozen on the wagon seat, her breath coming in quick gasps. When she finally managed to look toward the rocks, she saw a tall figure emerging, rifle in hand. As he drew closer, she made out a lean, broad-shouldered man with sun-darkened skin and eyes as blue as a summer sky. A dusty cowboy hat sat atop his head, and a star-shaped badge glinted on his vest. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat as he approached. "Quincy Porter, Deputy Marshal out of Fort Benton. Looks like I arrived just in time." Tessa found her voice at last. Yes, thank you, Deputy. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "Nothing good," he replied grimly, his eyes still scanning the horizon where the bandits had disappeared. "Those men are part of the Hawkins gang. They've been terrorizing travelers all through this territory." He turned back to her, his expression softening. "May I ask where you're headed all alone? It's dangerous country for a woman traveling without escort." "Helena," Tessa replied, tucking a strand of copper hair behind her ear. "My aunt lives there. I'm starting over." Deputy Porter nodded as if this explained everything. "Well, Miss Nelson, Tessa Nelson. Miss Nelson, I can't in good conscience let you continue alone. Those men might circle back once they're sure I'm gone. I'm headed toward Helena myself to deliver some paperwork to the territorial office. Would you permit me to accompany you?" Relief washed over Tessa like a cool breeze. "I would be most grateful, Deputy Porter." "Call me Quincy," he said with a small smile, the first she'd seen from him. It transformed his serious face, creating lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of a man who, despite his dangerous profession, hadn't forgotten how to laugh. "Then you must call me Tessa," she replied, returning his smile. As twilight descended over the Montana prairie, Quincy helped Tessa make camp, his movements efficient and practiced. He insisted she take shelter in her wagon while he slept outside beneath the stars, his rifle close at hand. That night, as Tessa lay listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie, she found herself thinking of the deputy's quick actions and quiet confidence. It had been a long time since anyone had protected her, and though she prided herself on her independence, there was something reassuring about his presence just outside her wagon. Little did she know that Quincy Porter was equally awake, contemplating the twist of fate that had led him to this lonely stretch of trail at precisely the right moment to save the copper-haired woman with eyes as green as prairie grass after a spring rain. Morning came with a golden brilliance that painted the landscape in hues of amber and bronze. Tessa awoke to the aroma of coffee brewing over a small campfire. She quickly pinned her hair and straightened her travel-worn dress before climbing down from the wagon. Quincy stood by the fire, his hat pushed back as he poured coffee into a tin cup. When he saw her, he nodded a greeting. "Sleep well, better than I expected," she admitted, accepting the cup he offered. "Thank you." "We should reach Elk Creek by nightfall," he said, gesturing toward the trail ahead. "There's a small way station there, safer than camping in the open again." As they broke camp and continued their journey, Tessa found herself stealing glances at the deputy. In the clear morning light, she could see details she'd missed the evening before: a thin scar that ran along his jawline, the way his sandy brown hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the capable hands that held the reins of his dappled gray horse as he rode alongside her wagon. "Have you been a deputy long?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Quincy adjusted his hat against the rising sun. 5 years, signed on after the war." "You fought in the war?" Tessa asked, surprised. He didn't look old enough to have served in the war between the states, which had ended 13 years earlier. A shadow crossed his face. "Joined up at 16, lied about my age, not uncommon in those days." Tessa did the calculation in her head. That would make him around 34 now, 12 years her senior, but not so great a difference as to be remarkable. "My father served with the Minnesota Regiment," she offered. "He never spoke much about it." "Most don't," Quincy replied simply. They traveled steadily through the morning, Quincy occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of information about the territory. He had a quiet way of speaking, his words carefully chosen, as if he was a man accustomed to measuring his thoughts before giving them voice. "What brings you to Helena?" he asked as they stopped to rest the horses at midday. Tessa hesitated, uncertain how much to share with this man who was still largely a stranger despite his kindness. "My father passed recently. The farm was mortgaged, and after settling his debts, there wasn't much left. My aunt wrote that Helena is growing rapidly, and there might be opportunities for someone willing to work hard." "I'm sorry about your father," Quincy said, genuine sympathy in his voice, "but your aunt is right. Helena's booming since they struck gold in Last Chance Gulch. Plenty of legitimate businesses setting up, not just saloons and gambling halls. I'm hoping to open a dress shop," Tessa confided, surprising herself with the admission. "I've always had a way with a needle. Made all my own clothes since I was 12. Quincy's eyes appraised the simple but well-made traveling dress she wore. "You've got talent from what I can see. Helena ladies would pay good money for fine dressmaking." His straightforward compliment brought a flush to Tessa's cheeks. "Thank you." "It's just a dream at this point." "Best things start as dreams," he replied, then gestured toward the wagon. "We should keep moving if we want to reach Elk Creek by sundown." As they continued their journey, Tessa found herself watching the way Quincy sat his horse, relaxed yet alert, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. There was something reassuring about his vigilance, a sense that nothing would take him by surprise. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Tessa was grateful for the bonnet that shaded her face. She had just taken a sip from her canteen when Quincy suddenly raised his hand, signaling her to stop. "What is it?" she whispered, fear clutching at her chest as she remembered the bandits from the previous day. Quincy pointed toward a cluster of cottonwood trees about a quarter-mile ahead. "Dust rising behind those trees. Someone's there." He guided his horse closer to her wagon. "Stay here. Keep your head down and that derringer ready. If I signal you, turn this wagon around and head back the way we came as fast as you can. But no arguments, Tessa, promise me." The intensity in his blue eyes silenced her protest. "I promise." Quincy nodded once, then urged his horse forward at a walk, his rifle now resting across his saddle. Tessa watched, her heart in her throat, as he approached the trees with caution. She had tucked her small derringer into her sleeve, ready to retrieve it if necessary. The minutes stretched endlessly as Quincy disappeared among the cottonwoods. Tessa strained to hear any sound of confrontation, but caught only the whisper of the prairie wind through the tall grass. Finally, just as she was considering disobeying his order and going to look for him, Quincy emerged from the trees, accompanied by an older man driving a buckboard wagon. Relief flooded through her as they approached. The stranger was white-haired and weather-beaten, with a smile that revealed several missing teeth. "Miss Nelson," Quincy called as they drew near. "This is Ezra Johnson. He's had some trouble with his wagon wheel, but it's fixed now. He's headed to Elk Creek as well." "Pleased to meet you, madam," Ezra said, tipping his battered hat. "Deputy here says you folks saved him the trouble of coming to my rescue when some no-good bandits tried to rob you yesterday." "Mr. Johnson was just telling me he saw that same gang pass by about an hour ago," Quincy added, his expression serious. "Headed east, thankfully, but it confirms my suspicion that we should stick together until we reach Helena." They continued as a small caravan, with Ezra's buckboard taking the lead, Tessa's wagon in the middle, and Quincy riding behind, keeping watch. The old man proved to be a talkative companion, filling the afternoon with stories of his 40 years in the territory. "Been here since before it was Montana territory," he boasted. "Seen Indians and buffalo by the thousands, gold rushes come and go, and now they're laying railroad tracks across the whole blamed country." His chatter was a welcome distraction from the tension of the journey, and Tessa found herself laughing at his colorful descriptions of frontier life. Occasionally, she would glance back at Quincy, who maintained his vigilant posture, though she caught the hint of a smile on his lips at some of Ezra's more outlandish tales. They reached Elk Creek just as the sun was setting, the way station a welcome sight after the long day's travel. It was a simple establishment, a low log building with attached stables, a corral for livestock, and a few crude cabins for travelers who preferred more privacy than the common room offered. The proprietor, a barrel-chested man named Silas, greeted them with gruff hospitality. "Got room for all of you, though the lady will have to take the small cabin out back. Only private space I got left." "That will be fine," Tessa assured him, grateful for any accommodation that offered a real roof. After seeing to the horses and securing their wagons, they gathered in the station's common room for a simple but hearty meal of venison stew and cornbread. A half-dozen other travelers shared the space two freight drivers headed to Fort Benton, a young couple journeying to visit family in Virginia City, and a quiet man in clerical collar who introduced himself as Pastor Matthew Wells. The conversation flowed easily, with Ezra dominating much of it, but Tessa noticed that Quincy maintained his reserved demeanor, contributing only occasionally. Still, she caught him watching her several times throughout the meal, his blue eyes thoughtful. As the evening wore on, the travelers began to drift toward their sleeping quarters. Ezra announced his intention to sample Silas's whiskey stocks before turning in, and the freight drivers joined him eagerly. The young couple and the pastor had already retired. "I'll walk you to your cabin," Quincy offered, rising from the rough-hewn bench where they had been sitting. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky like diamonds on black velvet. Their breath fogged in the chilly air as they crossed the yard to the small cabin at the edge of the property. "Thank you again for your protection," Tessa said as they reached the cabin door. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along yesterday." Quincy's expression grew serious. "I'm glad I was there. This territory can be unforgiving to those traveling alone." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but charged with unspoken thoughts. In the silver moonlight, Tessa could see the strong lines of his face, the way his eyes reflected the starlight. "Have you been alone long?" she asked suddenly, then flushed at her own boldness. "I apologize, that's too personal a question," but Quincy didn't seem offended. 7 years, he answered quietly. "My wife died in childbirth along with our son. After that, I took the badge and haven't stayed in one place too long since." Tessa's heart ached at the simple statement and the pain it conveyed. "I'm so sorry." He shrugged slightly as if to diminish the weight of his words. "Life goes on, you find purpose where you can." "Is that why you became a deputy?" she asked. "To find purpose, partly," he admitted. "And partly because I'm good with a gun and figured I might as well use that skill to help folks rather than harm them." The honesty in his voice touched something in Tessa. Here was a man who had suffered loss but had chosen to channel his pain into protecting others rather than surrendering to bitterness. "Well, I'm grateful for your skills," she said softly, "and for your company on this journey." A small smile lifted the corner of his mouth. "It's been my pleasure, Miss Nelson." "Tessa," she reminded him. "You promised to call me Tessa." "Tessa," he repeated, her name sounding different when spoken in his deep voice. "Sleep well. We've still got 2 days' travel to Helena if the weather holds." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, his tall figure cutting a sharp silhouette against the star-filled sky. "Quincy," she called after him, surprising herself. When he turned back, she found herself momentarily at a loss for words. "Be careful," she finally said. "Those bandits might still be around." His eyes softened. "I always am. Good night, Tessa." As she closed the cabin door behind her, Tessa pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beating of her heart. It was foolish to feel this way about a man she had known for barely a day, a man who would likely disappear from her life as soon as they reached Helena. Yet there was something about Quincy Porter that called to her his quiet strength, his hidden pain, the gentle way he spoke despite the dangerous life he led. Shaking her head at her own fanciful thoughts, Tessa prepared for bed, grateful for the simple comfort of the narrow cot after 2 weeks of sleeping in her wagon. Tomorrow would bring another long day of travel, and she needed her rest. Outside, unbeknownst to her, Quincy stood for a long moment looking at her cabin door, his own thoughts in turmoil. It had been years since he'd felt even a flicker of interest in a woman, years of deliberately keeping his distance, of burying himself in his work. But something about Tessa Nelson, her courage, her determination to forge a new life, the warmth in her green eyes had slipped past the barriers he'd so carefully constructed around his heart. With a sigh, he turned away. 2 more days to Helena, and then their paths would likely diverge forever. Best to remember that before he let himself feel anything more. Dawn broke with a sky streaked in pink and gold, promising fair weather for their continued journey. Tessa emerged from her cabin to find Quincy already at the stables, checking her wagon wheels and harnesses with methodical care. "Good morning," she called, approaching with a smile. "You're up early," he straightened, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Force of habit, wanted to make sure everything was in good order before we set out." "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "Is Mr. Johnson joining us again today?" Quincy's expression turned wry. "Ezra may be delayed. He and Silas's whiskey became well acquainted last night." Tessa laughed, the sound bright in the morning air. "Then perhaps we should have breakfast while we wait for him to recover." The common room was quieter than the previous evening, with most travelers having already departed. Silas's wife, a cheerful woman named Martha, served them plates of fried potatoes, bacon, and biscuits with honey. "Your timing's good," she commented as she poured coffee. "Storms brewing to the north, should reach here by nightfall, but if you make good time, you'll be well past it." Quincy nodded, his expression turning serious. "We'll head out as soon as possible then. Much obliged for the warning." They ate quickly, and Tessa went to gather her belongings while Quincy finished preparing the wagon. When she returned to the yard, she found him in conversation with Ezra, who looked somewhat worse for wear but insisted he was ready to travel. "Can't let a little whiskey slow me down," the old man declared, though his voice was raspier than usual. "Been drinking frontier spirits for 40 years. They set out as the sun climbed higher, following the same formation as the previous day. The trail widened as they traveled, evidence that they were approaching more settled areas. Occasionally, they passed other travelers' freight wagons headed to mining camps, settlers with their worldly possessions piled high, even a stagecoach that thundered past in a cloud of dust. The landscape began to change subtly, the open prairie giving way to rolling hills dotted with ponderosa pines. In the distance, the outline of mountains shimmered in the hazy light, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. "Beautiful country," Tessa remarked as they stopped to rest the horses at midday. Quincy nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon with appreciation. "Some of the finest in the territory. Wait until you see the view as we come into Helena Valley. It'll take your breath away." "Have you spent much time in Helena?" she asked, curious about his knowledge of her destination. "Some," he replied. "The territorial marshal's office is there. I report in every few months." Ezra joined them, carrying a canteen and a paper-wrapped package. "Martha packed us some bread and cold chicken," he announced, settling on a rock nearby. Woman's got a kind heart beneath that gruff exterior. As they shared the simple meal, Ezra entertained them with stories of Helena's early days. When they first struck gold in Last Chance Gulch, it was just a collection of tents and shacks. Now they've got proper buildings, churches, even a theater where they put on plays from back east. "Is it true they're building a proper courthouse?" Quincy asked. Ezra nodded vigorously. "Brick and stone, they say. And there's talk of the railroad coming through within the next few years. Helena's going to be the Queen City of the Rockies, mark my words." Tessa listened eagerly, her excitement growing at the prospect of starting her new life in such a promising place. "Do you think there might be a need for a dressmaker?" she asked. "I had hoped to open a shop eventually." "Why, there's ladies in Helena who'd pay a small fortune for a proper dress made by skilled hands," Ezra assured her, "those mining men who struck it rich. Their wives want to show off their newfound wealth, and fine clothes are the surest way to do it." Quincy smiled at her evident enthusiasm. "You might just find yourself with more business than you can handle." His confidence in her abilities warmed Tessa's heart. "I hope so. It's been my dream since I was a girl." They continued their journey, making good time despite the increasingly hilly terrain. By late afternoon, dark clouds had begun to gather on the horizon behind them, confirming Martha's prediction of an approaching storm. "We should push on to Ruby Creek," Quincy suggested, eyeing the threatening sky. "There's a roadhouse there where we can take shelter if needed." They urged their horses to a faster pace, the rumble of distant thunder spurring them onward. The wind had begun to pick up, bringing with it the scent of rain and the promise of a heavy downpour. They were still several miles from Ruby Creek when the storm caught them. The rain came suddenly, great sheets of water driven by gusting winds that bent the prairie grasses flat against the earth. Lightning split the darkened sky, followed by crashes of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. "There's a line shack up ahead," Quincy shouted over the storm's roar, pointing toward a barely visible structure nestled against a hillside. "We can wait it out there." They made their way toward the shelter, fighting against the wind and rain. The line shack, a crude structure used by cowboys during roundups, was small but sturdy, its roof intact enough to keep out the worst of the deluge. Quincy helped Tessa down from her wagon seat, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment, as she slid to the ground, they stood close enough that she could see raindrops clinging to his eyelashes, could feel the warmth of his breath against her face. Then he stepped back, turning to assist Ezra, who was struggling with his team of horses. They managed to secure the animals beneath a lean-to attached to the shack, providing what shelter they could from the tempest. Inside, the one-room structure was sparse but dry, with a small iron stove, a rough table, and several bunks built into the walls. "Not exactly the Willard Hotel," Quincy remarked dryly as he lit a lamp he found on the table, "but it'll keep us alive." Ezra shook water from his hat, looking like a half-drowned rat. "Beats being out in that," he agreed, gesturing toward the door where rain continued to lash against the weathered boards. Tessa wrung water from her skirts, grateful for the shelter despite its humble nature. "How long do you think the storm will last?" Quincy was already kneeling by the stove, arranging kindling from a box beside it. "Hard to say. These summer storms can blow through quickly or settle in for hours." He coaxed a fire to life in the stove, the small flame gradually growing as it consumed the dry wood. Warmth began to spread through the chilly shack, and they gathered around it gratefully, stripping off wet outer garments and hanging them to dry. Outside, the storm continued unabated, wind howling around the corners of the small building and rain drumming on the roof. Lightning flashed with increasing frequency, each bolt followed by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of their shelter. "Haven't seen a storm like this in years," Ezra commented, accepting the jerky Quincy produced from his saddlebags. "Reminds me of the time I was caught out near the Yellowstone. Lightning struck so close it set my horse's mane to standing on end." As Ezra launched into yet another tale of frontier survival, Tessa found herself watching Quincy. He had removed his vest and rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars. His face in profile was strong and weathered, yet there was a gentleness to his expression as he listened to the old man's story with patient attention. When the storytelling finally wound down and Ezra stretched out on one of the bunks for a nap, Tessa and Quincy sat in companionable silence by the stove. The storm showed no signs of abating, the rain continuing to pour down in torrential sheets. "We may have to spend the night," Quincy said at last, his voice low so as not to disturb the now snoring Ezra. "It'll be dark soon, and the trail will be washed out in places." Tessa nodded, surprisingly unconcerned by the prospect. "It's safe here, safe enough," he assured her. "Line shacks are well known to travelers. It's an unwritten law of the frontier that you leave them as you found them, maybe a little better. Wood stocked, matches dry, basic provisions if you can spare them. It's a kind system," Tessa observed. "People looking out for those who will come after them." "Out here, that kind of thinking keeps people alive," Quincy replied. He hesitated, then added, "Are you worried about reaching Helena on time? Is your aunt expecting you?" "She knows I'm coming, but not exactly when," Tessa explained. "The journey from Minnesota takes different amounts of time depending on the conditions. I wrote that I hope to arrive by mid-August, which still gives me nearly 2 weeks. Relief flickered across Quincy's face. "Good, I wouldn't want you to feel rushed into traveling in dangerous conditions." His concern touched her. "What about you? Will you be missed if you're delayed?" A small smile curved his lips. "The territorial marshal is used to deputies arriving when they arrive. The territory's too vast and the conditions too unpredictable for precise schedules." As darkness fell outside, they prepared a simple meal from their combined provisions, more jerky, hardtack biscuits softened over the stove, and the last of Tessa's dried apples. Ezra woke long enough to eat, then promptly fell back asleep, his snores providing a counterpoint to the storm's continuing fury. Quincy insisted that Tessa take the cleanest of the bunks while he would keep watch by the stove. "I'm used to irregular sleep," he assured her when she protested. "And someone should stay alert in case the weather shifts." Tessa reluctantly agreed, settling onto the narrow bunk with her shawl as a pillow. Despite the storm and the strange surroundings, she felt oddly at peace. Perhaps it was the solid presence of Quincy Porter sitting by the stove, his rifle within easy reach, or perhaps it was simply exhaustion catching up with her after days of tense travel. She drifted towards sleep, lulled by the rhythm of the rain and the occasional crack of the fire as Quincy added another piece of wood. Her last conscious thought was that she felt safer in this crude shelter with him than she had felt anywhere since her father died. Sometime in the night, Tessa awoke to a change in the sounds around her. The rain had stopped and the wind had died down to a gentle whisper. Moonlight streamed through the single window, casting silver patterns across the rough plank floor. Quincy sat where she had last seen him, his back against the wall, head tilted slightly as if listening to the night. In the moonlight, his features seemed carved from stone, beautiful in their stark simplicity. As if sensing her gaze, he turned toward her. "Storm's past," he said softly. "Sky's clearing." Tessa sat up, pushing hair from her face. "You should rest now. I can keep watch for a while." He shook his head. "I'm fine. Go back to sleep. We'll start at first light." But sleep had fled, and Tessa found herself fully awake. She rose from the bunk and moved to sit across from him at the small table. "Tell me about being a deputy marshal," she said. "Is it very dangerous?" Quincy considered her question, his blue eyes thoughtful in the dim light. "It can be. The territory's still wild in many ways, laws spread thin." "Yet you chose it," she observed, after your loss." He was silent for a long moment, and Tessa feared she had overstepped, but when he spoke, his voice was steady if quiet. "After Sarah and the baby died, I couldn't stay in one place, too many memories. The badge gave me purpose, a reason to keep moving." "Do you ever think of settling somewhere again?" Tessa asked, her heart beating faster at her own boldness. Quincy's gaze met hers across the table, something unreadable in his eyes. "I didn't, not until recently." The implications of his words hung in the air between them, neither willing to acknowledge them directly. Instead, Tessa asked, "What was she like, your wife?" A soft smile touched his lips, tinged with old sorrow but not overwhelmed by it. "Sarah was kind, laughed easily. Made friends wherever we went. She had dark hair, always escaping its pins, and courage she had that in abundance." "She sounds wonderful," Tessa said sincerely. "She was," Quincy agreed. "She would have liked you." The simple statement brought unexpected tears to Tessa's eyes. She blinked them away, touched by his openness. "What about you?" he asked. "Any young man back in Minnesota who'll be writing letters to Helena?" Tessa shook her head. "No, there was someone once, but..." She hesitated, then decided on honesty. He wanted a traditional wife. Someone content to keep house and raise children. When I spoke of my dreams for a dress shop, he laughed, said it was a foolish fancy that I'd forget once we were married. Quincy's expression darkened. "Some men fear a woman with her own mind. Are you one of them?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. His eyes held hers steadily. "No, I believe a person should follow their talents where they lead, man or woman." In the silver moonlight, with only the soft crackle of the dying fire to break the silence, something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of mutual respect, of shared understanding despite their different paths. "We should try to rest," Quincy said at last, his voice gentle. "Morning will be here soon enough." Tessa nodded and returned to her bunk, but sleep was elusive. Instead, she lay awake listening to the night sounds, her thoughts filled with the quiet deputy and the unexpected connection forming between them. Morning arrived with brilliant sunshine and a freshly washed world. The storm had cleared the air, leaving behind a sky of perfect blue and the scent of damp earth and pine. They set out early, eager to make up for lost time, the muddy trail the only evidence of the previous night's tempest. Ezra was in high spirits, apparently rejuvenated by his long sleep. "Nothing like a good storm to clear the sinuses," he declared, breathing deeply as they traveled. "And look at that sky, God's own ceiling, I always say." They made good progress, the horses seemingly as eager as their human companions to reach their destination. By midday, the landscape had changed dramatically, the rolling hills giving way to the more dramatic contours of the mountain foothills. Pine forests grew denser, occasionally opening to reveal breathtaking vistas of the valley below. "We'll reach Helena by tomorrow afternoon," Quincy announced as they stopped to water the horses at a clear running stream, assuming no more unexpected delays. The knowledge that their journey was nearing its end filled Tessa with conflicting emotions. Excitement at reaching her destination and beginning her new life mingled with a surprising reluctance to part from Quincy's company. Their last night on the trail was spent at Ruby Creek, the roadhouse offering welcome comfort after their primitive shelter of the previous night. A real dinner of venison stew, fresh bread, and apple pie lifted everyone's spirits, and even Quincy seemed more relaxed as they sat in the roadhouse's common room after the meal. Ezra had found a checkerboard and was engaged in a spirited match with another traveler, their good-natured arguments providing entertainment for everyone nearby. Tessa and Quincy sat slightly apart, watching the game but lost in their own thoughts. "Your aunt," Quincy said suddenly, breaking their companionable silence. "What's her name? Perhaps I've encountered her in my travels." "Margaret Wilson," Tessa replied. "She married a miner who did well enough to open a general store on Last Chance Gulch." "That's where I'll be staying until I can establish myself," Quincy nodded. Wilson's General Goods, I know it, good reputation, fair prices. A small silence fell between them again, laden with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Tessa gathered her courage. Will you? That is, might I see you again in Helena? Perhaps you could call when your duties bring you to town. Something flickered in Quincy's blue eyes, hope, perhaps, or hesitation. I'd like that, he said quietly, if you're sure your aunt wouldn't object to a deputy calling. Tessa smiled, her heart lightening. I'm of age to choose my own callers, Deputy Porter. His answering smile transformed his serious face, creating the lines at the corners of his eyes that she had come to look for. Then I'll certainly call Miss Nelson. The promise carried them through the evening and into the next day's travel, the final leg of their journey to Helena. As they crested the last rise before the valley opened before them, Quincy reined his horse beside Tessa's wagon. There it is, he said, gesturing toward the settlement spread below them. Helena. Tessa caught her breath at the sight. The town was larger than she had expected, a substantial collection of buildings nestled in the valley with mountains rising majestically behind it. Streets were laid out in a grid pattern, with larger structures of brick and stone dominating the center of town. Church spires rose above the rooftops, and even from this distance, she could see the activity of a thriving community. It's beautiful, she murmured, taking in the panorama before her. Queen City of the Rockies, Ezra proclaimed proudly from his buckboard. Didn't I tell you? They descended into the valley, the road widening and improving as they approached the outskirts of town. Wagons and riders passed them with increasing frequency, dust rising from the well-traveled thoroughfare. Signs of civilization multiplied fenced properties, cultivated fields, even a small orchard of young apple trees. Entering Helena proper was a sensory experience after weeks on the trail. The sounds of commerce filled the air, hammers striking anvils at the blacksmith's forge, the calls of vendors selling their wares, the laughter of children playing in the streets. Smells mingled in a complex tapestry, fresh bread from a bakery, leather from the saddler's shop, coffee roasting somewhere nearby. Tessa took it all in with wide eyes, her excitement growing with each new sight. This would be her home now, this vibrant, growing community where she would build her new life. Quincy guided them through the busy streets with the confidence of someone familiar with the town's layout. Last Chance Gulch is the main thoroughfare, he explained, gesturing toward the wide street ahead. Most businesses are located there or nearby. They turned onto the bustling street, navigating around freight wagons, riders, and pedestrians going about their daily business. Tessa scanned the storefronts eagerly, noting the variety of establishments: a hotel with an ornate facade, several saloons with swinging doors, a bank constructed of solid brick, shops selling everything from mining equipment to fine millinery. There, Quincy said, pointing toward a two-story building with a broad front porch. A sign hung above the entrance. Wilson's General Goods, fair prices, quality merchandise. As they approached, a woman emerged from the store, tall and straight-backed, with graying auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. She shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, then let out a cry of recognition. Tessa, oh, my dear girl, you've arrived at last. Margaret Wilson hurried down the steps as Quincy helped Tessa from the wagon. Aunt Margaret embraced her niece warmly, then held her at arm's length for inspection. Let me look at you. So like your mother, God rest her soul, you've made good time. We weren't expecting you for another week at least. The journey was easier thanks to my companions, Tessa replied, turning to introduce Quincy and Ezra. Deputy Porter saved me from bandits on the trail, and Mr. Johnson joined us for the final leg. Margaret's eyes widened at the mention of bandits, but she quickly composed herself and extended gracious thanks to both men. You must come in for refreshments. My husband will want to thank you properly for delivering our niece safely. Inside the store, Thomas Wilson greeted them with equal warmth, insisting they share the noon meal with the family. As they gathered around the table in the living quarters behind the store, Tessa felt a curious mix of emotions: relief at reaching her destination safely, excitement about her new beginning, and an undeniable sadness at the thought that Quincy would soon return to his duties. Throughout the meal, she was aware of his presence across the table, his quiet contributions to the conversation, the way his eyes occasionally sought hers. When the time came for farewells, Tessa followed the men outside to the porch, her heart heavy despite the joy of reunion with her relatives. Ezra was effusive in his goodbyes, extracting promises that Tessa would visit his sister's boarding house where he would be staying. "Finest cook in the territory," he assured her. "You come for Sunday dinner next week, and you'll see I don't exaggerate." When he had finally departed, full of good food and good wishes, Tessa found herself alone with Quincy on the store's porch. He stood with his hat in his hands, the afternoon sun glinting on his sandy hair. "Thank you again," she said softly, "for everything." Quincy nodded, his expression serious. "It was my duty." Was it only duty? The words escaped before she could reconsider them. His blue eyes met hers directly. "No," he admitted, "not only duty." Relief and something warmer flooded through her. "Will you call when you're next in Helena?" "I'll be here for at least a week," he replied, a small smile softening his features. "Reporting to the marshal and delivering those papers I mentioned. Perhaps I might call tomorrow evening, if that's not too soon." "Tomorrow would be perfect," Tessa said, unable to hide her pleasure at the prospect. "Aunt Margaret mentioned a social at the church on Saturday. Perhaps you might accompany me?" "I'd be honored," Quincy replied, his formal words belied by the warmth in his eyes. He replaced his hat and prepared to leave, then hesitated. "Tessa," he said, his voice low, "I want you to know, that is, I hope you understand." "Yes," she prompted when he faltered. Quincy took a deep breath. "I haven't felt this way in a very long time. It's unexpected." The simple admission touched her deeply. "For me as well," she confessed, "but not unwelcome." His smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then brilliant. "Until tomorrow, then." "Until tomorrow," she echoed, watching as he mounted his horse and rode away toward the territorial offices, his straight back and broad shoulders a familiar sight after their days of travel together. Inside, Aunt Margaret was waiting with curiosity written plainly across her features. "A deputy marshal, she said with a knowing smile, "and a handsome one at that." Tessa felt herself blushing. "He's a good man, Aunt Margaret, kind and honorable, the best kind," her aunt agreed, patting her hand. "Now come, let me show you to your room. You must be exhausted after your journey." As she followed her aunt up the narrow stairs to the second floor, Tessa's thoughts remained with Quincy. Their journey together had ended, but something new was beginning, something full of promise and possibility. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Tessa settled into life in Helena. Her aunt and uncle had prepared a comfortable room for her in their home above the store, and she quickly established a routine, helping in the store during the day, exploring the town in her free time, and in the evenings, often enjoying Quincy's company. True to his word, he had called the day after their arrival, and their conversations had flowed as easily in the Wilsons' parlor as they had around campfires on the trail. The church social had been followed by other outings, a community picnic by the creek, an evening lecture at the newly established library, walks through town as Quincy pointed out places of interest. Margaret watched their growing attachment with approving eyes, though she gently cautioned Tessa about the realities of caring for a lawman. "It's not an easy life, my dear. There will be long absences and constant worry." "I understand," Tessa had replied. "But worth it, I think, for the right person." And Quincy Porter increasingly seemed to be that person. As the days passed, Tessa came to know him better, his quiet sense of humor, his thoughtfulness, his unwavering sense of justice. He spoke more freely of his past, sharing stories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his time in the Union Army, and the brief, happy years of his marriage. In turn, she told him of her dreams for the future, her determination to establish herself as a dressmaker, her hope to create beautiful garments that would bring joy to their wearers. Her opportunity came sooner than expected when Mrs. Hargrove, wife of the bank president, visited Wilson's General Goods seeking fabric for a new dress. Overhearing her frustration at the lack of skilled seamstresses in town, Margaret had promptly introduced Tessa. "My niece is a gifted dressmaker, Mrs. Hargrove. Perhaps she might be of assistance." The elegantly dressed woman had assessed Tessa with shrewd eyes. "Have you samples of your work, Miss Nelson?" "Only what I'm wearing," Tessa admitted, indicating her neatly tailored day dress. "But I'd be happy to sketch some designs for your consideration." Impressed by both the quality of Tessa's dress and her confident manner, Mrs. Hargrove had commissioned a gown for an upcoming social event at the governor's residence. "If the result is satisfactory, I shall recommend you to my friends," she promised. That evening, when Quincy called, Tessa could barely contain her excitement as she shared the news. They sat in the small garden behind the Wilsons' home, the August evening warm and fragrant with late-blooming roses. "It's happening, Quincy. My dream is actually beginning to happen," she exclaimed, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. His smile was warm as he watched her animated gestures. "I never doubted it would. You have both talent and determination, a powerful combination." "And a powerful patron, if Mrs. Hargrove is pleased," Tessa added. "She's connected to everyone who matters in Helena society." "When will you start?" he asked. "Tomorrow." "She's bringing the fabric in the morning, and we'll finalize the design." Tessa's hands moved expressively as she described her plans. "I'm thinking of a deep blue silk with subtle detailing at the bodice, nothing too elaborate that would overwhelm her small frame, but enough to showcase the quality of the work." Quincy listened attentively, admiring her passion and knowledge. When she finally paused for breath, he reached over and took her hand in his. "I'm proud of you, Tessa, truly." The simple statement warmed her heart more than elaborate praise could have done. "Thank you," she said softly. "Your belief in me means a great deal." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands still linked, the garden around them peaceful in the gathering twilight. Finally, Quincy spoke, his voice more serious than before. "I received new orders today. The marshal wants me to investigate reports of cattle rustling near the Blackfoot Reservation." Tessa felt her heart sink. "When do you leave?" 3 days from now," he replied. "I could be gone for several weeks." She nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "I understand, it's your duty." Quincy's blue eyes studied her face intently. "Before I go, there's something I want to ask you." The gravity in his tone made Tessa's heart beat faster. "Yes," he took both her hands in his expression earnest. "I know we've known each other only a short time, barely a month since that day on the trail. But I've come to care for you deeply, Tessa, more than I thought possible after losing Sarah." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I'm not asking for any promises now. It's too soon, and you're just beginning to build the life you've dreamed of, but I want you to know my intentions are serious. When I return, if your feelings haven't changed, I'd like to court you properly with a view toward a future together." Joy bloomed in Tessa's heart, bright and unexpected. "Quincy," she said softly, squeezing his hands, "my feelings won't change. I've known since those days on the trail that there was something special between us." Relief and happiness transformed his face. "So you'll allow me to court you when I return?" "Yes," she replied simply. "I'd like that very much." His smile then was so brilliant it rivaled the first stars appearing in the evening sky. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Tessa responded with a sweetness that answered his unspoken question. Yes, her heart said as their lips met, yes to this moment, yes to the possibility of a shared future. When they parted, Quincy reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver pin shaped like a star, similar to his deputy's badge but smaller and more delicately crafted. "I had this made for you," he said, offering it on his palm. "A remembrance while I'm away." Tessa accepted the gift, touched by the thoughtfulness behind it. "It's beautiful," she murmured, pinning it to her dress. "I'll wear it every day until you return. And I'll come back to you as soon as my duty allows," he promised, his voice fervent with sincerity. The next 3 days passed in a bittersweet blur as Tessa divided her time between preparations for Mrs. Hargrove's dress and savoring every moment with Quincy before his departure. They walked through town together, rode to the overlook where they had first seen Helena, shared meals with the Wilsons and with Ezra at his sister's boarding house. On the morning of Quincy's departure, Tessa rose early to see him off. They stood outside the livery stable where he had just collected his freshly shod horse, the pre-dawn air crisp with approaching autumn. "Be careful," she urged, straightening his bandana with gentle hands. "The rustlers might be desperate if they're cornered." "I'm always careful," he assured her, covering her hands with his own. "I have more reason than ever to return safely." Their farewell was brief but heartfelt, sealed with a kiss that carried the promise of reunion. As Quincy mounted his horse and rode away, Tessa touched the silver star pinned to her dress, a tangible reminder of the man who had so unexpectedly captured her heart. The weeks of Quincy's absence were filled with activity as Tessa established herself in Helena society. Mrs. Hargrove's dress was a triumph, leading to commissions from other prominent ladies in town. Word of her skill spread rapidly, and soon she had more work than she could comfortably manage from her room at the Wilsons'. "You need a proper workspace," Uncle Thomas declared over dinner one evening in late September. "The old millinery shop on Cedar Street is vacant since Mrs. Prout moved to Bozeman. Reasonable rent, good location, living quarters in the back." The idea took hold immediately. The following day, Tessa and her aunt visited the property, a charming storefront with large windows perfect for displaying sample gowns, a spacious workroom, and modest but comfortable living quarters consisting of a bedroom, small sitting room, and kitchen. "It's perfect," Tessa breathed, already envisioning how she would arrange the space. "But the rent." "You have savings from your commissions," Margaret reminded her, "and Thomas and I would be happy to help with the initial expenses as a belated birthday gift." "You've done so much already," Tessa protested. Margaret waved away her objection. "Nonsense, family helps family. Besides, it's a sound investment. You'll be established and self-supporting in no time at this rate," and so it was decided. By the first week of October, Tessa's fine dressmaking opened its doors on Cedar Street, the windows tastefully displaying a sample evening gown in rich burgundy velvet and a walking dress of forest green wool trimmed with black braid. Tessa's days fell into a new rhythm, consulting with clients, drafting patterns, cutting fabric, and stitching into the evening hours by lamplight. She hired a young girl named Alice to help with simple sewing and to mind the shop when Tessa was busy with fittings, finding her to be a quick study with a natural eye for detail. Through it all, Tessa watched for news of Quincy. Occasional messages reached her through the marshal's office brief notes, assuring her of his well-being and progress with the investigation. She wrote to him care of the agency at the Blackfoot Reservation, detailed letters sharing her daily life and growing business, hoping they would find their way to him in the field. October gave way to November, bringing the first dusting of snow to Helena's streets and a heightened anticipation of Quincy's return. When the bell above her shop door jingled one frosty afternoon, Tessa looked up from her cutting table expecting to see a client, only to find Quincy Porter standing in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the bright winter light. "Quincy." She gasped, dropping her scissors and rushing toward him. He caught her in his arms, lifting her slightly off the floor in his enthusiasm. "I came straight from the marshal's office," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Had to see you first thing." Tessa drew back just enough to study his face. He looked leaner than before, his skin more weathered from weeks in the open, but his blue eyes were as warm as she remembered, now crinkled with pleasure as he gazed down at her. "You're really here," she murmured, touching his cheek to reassure herself of his solidity. "Safe and sound." "As promised," he replied, then glanced around the shop with admiration. "And you look at what you've accomplished while I was away, your own establishment, just as you dreamed." Pride swelled in Tessa's heart as she gave him a tour of the shop, showing him her workroom and living quarters, introducing him to Alice, who watched with wide-eyed curiosity. The young assistant tactfully excused herself to run errands, leaving them alone in the cozy sitting room. "I've missed you," Quincy said simply when they were seated side by side on the small sofa. "Thought of you every day." "And I you," Tessa replied, her hand finding his. "Did you receive my letters?" "Every one," he confirmed. They were a lifeline in some difficult moments. "Was it very dangerous?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Quincy shrugged slightly. "We had a few close calls. The rustlers were more organized than we expected. Turned out they had connections to a larger operation running stolen cattle into Canada, but we got them in the end." His matter-of-fact tone didn't fool Tessa. She had heard enough frontier stories to know that a few close calls likely meant life-threatening situations, but she simply squeezed his hand, understanding that this was part of loving a lawman. "How long can you stay in Helena?" she asked. "That's the best part," Quincy replied, his expression brightening. "The marshal has assigned me to the Helena office permanently. I'll still have to ride circuit occasionally, but this will be my home base now." Joy surged through Tessa at the news. "Truly, you'll be stationed here." Quincy nodded, his smile widening. "Truly, the town's growing fast and they need experienced deputies to maintain order. And," he hesitated, then continued more softly, "I might have mentioned that I had personal reasons for preferring Helena to other postings." "What personal reasons might those be, Deputy Porter?" Tessa asked, her tone teasing despite the rapid beating of her heart. In answer, Quincy leaned forward and kissed her a deeper, more certain kiss than their previous ones, conveying all the longing of their weeks apart. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, his expression was tender yet serious. "I meant what I said before I left, Tessa. My intentions are serious. I'd like to court you properly if you're still willing." "More than willing," she assured him, her green eyes bright with happiness. The winter months that followed were among the happiest of Tessa's life. Her business continued to flourish, with orders coming in steadily as her reputation for quality workmanship spread throughout Helena and beyond. She hired a second assistant, expanded her selection of fabrics, and even began creating ready-made garments for those who couldn't afford custom work. Quincy settled into his new position with the marshal's office, his experience and steady temperament earning him respect among both colleagues and townspeople. True to his word, he courted Tessa with proper attention, escorting her to church socials and community events, joining the Wilsons for Sunday dinners, bringing small but thoughtful gifts when he called at her shop. As Christmas approached, Helena took on a festive atmosphere despite the deep snow that blanketed the streets. Evergreen boughs decorated storefronts, candles glowed in windows, and the sound of carols filled the air on December evenings. Tessa's shop was busier than ever with holiday orders, party dresses, warm cloaks, special garments for Christmas celebrations. She worked long hours, grateful for her assistant's help, but still finding herself stitching by lamplight well into the night on many occasions. One such evening, just a week before Christmas, she looked up from her work at the sound of a knock on her back door. Opening it, she found Quincy standing in the swirling snow, his hat and shoulders dusted with white. "You're working too hard," he said by way of greeting, stepping inside and stamping snow from his boots. "It's nearly midnight." "Mrs. Ellsworth needs her dress for the Christmas Eve service," Tessa explained, gesturing toward the half-finished garment of deep green wool. "And I promised the Hargrove girls their new cloaks by tomorrow." Quincy shook his head, concern evident in his expression. "You need rest, Tessa. You can't keep these hours and stay healthy." "Just until Christmas," she assured him, touched by his worry. "After the holidays, things will slow down." He removed his coat and hung it by the door, then surprised her by rolling up his shirt sleeves. "Well then, what can I do to help? I'm reasonably handy with tools. Surely there's something I can manage." Tessa laughed at the unexpected offer. "Can you thread needles?" "I've been squinting so long my eyes are crossing." And so they spent the next hour in companionable work, Tessa stitching the fine details of Mrs. Ellsworth's dress, while Quincy prepared needles, wound thread onto bobbins, and even managed to sew buttons onto the simpler garments under her direction. "You're quite skilled," she observed as he completed a row of buttons with neat precision. "Where did you learn to sew?" "Army," he replied with a wry smile. Every soldier learns basic mending if he wants to keep his uniform from falling apart, and after Sarah died. Well, I had to manage for myself. They worked in comfortable silence for a while longer until Tessa finally set aside the completed dress with a sigh of satisfaction. "That's enough for tonight," she declared, stretching to ease the stiffness in her shoulders. "Thank you for your help." "My pleasure," Quincy replied, helping her tidy the workroom. "Though I came with another purpose besides serving as your apprentice." "Oh." Tessa looked up with curiosity as she covered her sewing machine. Quincy reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small envelope. "An invitation," he explained, handing it to her. "The marshal's office is hosting a Christmas dinner for deputies and their special companions. I'd be honored if you would attend with me." Tessa opened the envelope, finding a neatly printed invitation inside. "I'd love to," she said warmly. "When is it?" "2 days before Christmas," he replied. "Nothing too formal, just good food and good company." As he helped her extinguish the lamps and lock up the shop, Tessa felt a deep contentment settle over her. This would be her first Christmas in Helena, her first holiday season in her new life, and she would share it with the man who had become so important to her in such a short time. The marshal's Christmas dinner was held in the newly completed courthouse, the large meeting room transformed with evergreen decorations, red ribbons, and dozens of candles. Tessa wore a gown of her own creation, deep burgundy silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simple yet elegant. Quincy, resplendent in a formal suit rather than his usual working clothes, couldn't take his eyes off her as they entered the gathering. "You're the most beautiful woman here," he murmured for her ears alone. The evening was filled with good food, lively conversation, and the warm camaraderie of people who faced danger together and understood the value of peaceful moments. Marshal Davis, a gruff but kind-hearted man in his 50s, made a point of speaking privately with Tessa. "Porter's the best deputy I've got," he told her, his voice lowered confidentially. "Been a different man since he met you, got a light in his eyes again. Haven't seen that since before he lost his wife." Tessa blushed at the marshal's frank assessment. "He's a good man," she replied simply. "The best," Davis agreed, "and smart enough to recognize a remarkable woman when he finds one." As the evening progressed, someone began playing a fiddle and couples moved to the cleared space for dancing. Quincy led Tessa onto the floor, his hand warm at her waist as they moved through the steps of a waltz. "Happy?" he asked softly as they circled the room. "Very," she assured him, her eyes shining in the candlelight. "This is more than I ever dreamed possible when I set out from Minnesota." "You've built something wonderful here," Quincy said, his admiration evident. "Your shop, your reputation, your independence, all through your own talent and determination." The music slowed, and their steps with it, until they were barely moving, simply swaying together in the corner of the room. "Tessa," Quincy said, his voice low and serious, "there's something I want to ask you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes, not here," he decided, glancing around at the crowded room. "Will you walk with me, just for a few minutes?" Curious, Tessa nodded. They retrieved their coats and slipped outside onto the courthouse steps. The night was clear and cold, stars blazing in the velvet sky above Helena's snow-covered streets. Their breath formed clouds in the frosty air as they stood close together for warmth. Quincy turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I had planned to wait until Christmas," he began, his voice slightly unsteady. "Had it all arranged, a special dinner, a carefully rehearsed speech, but seeing you tonight, so beautiful, so beloved by everyone who knows you, I find I can't wait any longer." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small box covered in dark blue velvet. Tessa's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring, a perfect oval sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds, set in delicate gold filigree. "Tessa Nelson," Quincy said, his blue eyes holding hers with absolute sincerity, "I love you. These past months have shown me that life can begin again after loss, that joy can return when you least expect it. You've brought light back into my world, and I want nothing more than to share the rest of my days with you." He took a deep breath, then continued, "I know your independence is precious to you, and I would never ask you to give up the business you've worked so hard to build. But I hope you might consider building a life with me alongside it. Will you marry me?" Tears of happiness filled Tessa's eyes, spilling onto her cheeks despite her best efforts to contain them. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Quincy. I love you, and nothing would make me happier than to be your wife." Joy transformed his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership. The sapphire glinted in the starlight the same deep blue as his eyes, Tessa realized with delight. "It's beautiful," she said when they finally parted, admiring the ring on her hand. "How did you know I prefer sapphires to diamonds?" Quincy smiled, a hint of mischief in his expression. "I pay attention. You once mentioned that your mother had a sapphire pendant you loved as a child, and you're drawn to blue fabrics in your shop. You handle them more often, hold them up to the light." His attentiveness touched her deeply. "When?" she asked simply. "When shall we marry?" "Spring." He suggested. "When the snow melts and the world turns green again, or sooner if you prefer, spring would be perfect," Tessa agreed. "April, perhaps. The business slows after Easter and the weather should be favorable for a celebration." They returned to the party hand in hand, their happiness so evident that announcements proved unnecessary. Congratulations surrounded them from all sides, along with good-natured teasing for Quincy and warm wishes for Tessa. The Christmas season passed in a blur of joy as they shared their news with the Wilsons, with Ezra, who claimed to have predicted it from the moment they arrived in Helena, and with Tessa's clients and friends. Letters were dispatched to distant relatives, and plans began to take shape for an April wedding. Winter settled fully over Helena, bringing bitter cold and deep snow that transformed the bustling town into a quieter, more intimate place. Business at the dress shop slowed as expected after the holiday rush, giving Tessa more time to consider her future with Quincy. One evening in late January, as they sat before the fire in her small sitting room, she broached a subject that had been on her mind. "I've been thinking about the shop," she began, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "About how it might work after we're married." Quincy set aside the book he'd been reading, giving her his full attention. "What are your thoughts?" "I want to continue, of course," she said, twisting her engagement ring absently, "but perhaps with some changes. Alice has shown real talent. I've been teaching her to draft patterns and work with clients. I thought perhaps she could take on more responsibility, allowing me more time at our home." The words "our home" still felt new and wonderful on her tongue. They had yet to decide where they would live after the wedding. Quincy had rooms above the gunsmith shop, but they were bachelor's quarters, too small for a married couple. "Whatever you want is fine with me," Quincy assured her. "I meant what I said. I would never ask you to give up something that brings you such fulfillment." Tessa moved from her chair to sit beside him on the small sofa, taking his hand in hers. "The shop does fulfill me," she acknowledged. "But so do you, and I've been thinking about the future, about children, perhaps someday." Quincy's expression softened at the mention of children. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "A family with you, Tessa. It's more than I ever dared hope for after Sarah." "We could convert the back room of the shop into a nursery eventually," she suggested. "That way I could continue working while caring for a baby, or we could find a house," Quincy countered, warming to the discussion. "Something not too far from both the shop and the marshal's office. A place with a garden, perhaps, and room for children to play." They spent the evening discussing possibilities, their conversation ranging from practical considerations to dreams for the future. By the time Quincy reluctantly took his leave, propriety still demanded separate residences. Until their wedding, they had agreed to begin looking for a suitable house as soon as the spring thaw allowed. February brought Valentine's Day and a special gift from Quincy, a bolt of silk in the most exquisite shade of ivory Tessa had ever seen, accompanied by delicate lace from Brussels that must have cost a small fortune. "For your wedding dress," he explained as she ran reverent fingers over the lustrous fabric. "I know most brides commission their gowns, but I thought you might want to create your own." Tears pricked Tessa's eyes at his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." The following weeks were filled with wedding preparations alongside the daily work of the dress shop. The Wilsons insisted on hosting the ceremony and reception at their home, which boasted the largest garden in Helena. Invitations were sent, responses received, and arrangements made for flowers, music, and refreshments throughout it all. Tessa worked on her wedding dress in secret hours, creating a gown that would reflect both her skill as a dressmaker and her joy as a bride. The design was elegant in its simplicity, the ivory silk falling in clean lines from a fitted bodice adorned with the Brussels lace, the sleeves long and tapered to points at her wrists, the train modest but dignified. March arrived with the first hints of spring, longer days, occasional thaws, and the stirring of new life beneath the snow. Quincy, with the help of Thomas Wilson and several fellow deputies, located a perfect house just 2 streets away from Tessa's shop, a charming 2-story home with a wide front porch, 4 bedrooms, and a garden already planted with fruit trees and perennial flowers. "It needs some work," Quincy admitted as he showed Tessa through the rooms for the first time, "but the structure is sound and we can make improvements over time." Tessa walked from room to room, envisioning their life together in this space, meals in the sunny kitchen, quiet evenings in the parlor, children running up and down the sturdy staircase. "It's perfect," she declared, turning to embrace him. "Absolutely perfect." They purchased the house with their combined savings, and Quincy immediately began repairs, working alongside carpenters and painters to prepare their home for occupation after the wedding. Furniture was selected, some pieces brought from Tessa's quarters behind the shop, others purchased new or received as early wedding gifts. As April approached, Helena emerged from winter's grip, the streets muddy but the air fresh with the promise of growth and renewal. The date was set for April 15th, and as the day drew nearer, excitement built throughout the community. Tessa's was the first spring wedding of the season, and in a town that cherished celebrations after the long winter isolation, it was an eagerly anticipated event. The evening before the wedding, Tessa closed her shop early and walked with Quincy to their new home, now ready for occupation. They stood in the empty parlor, sunlight streaming through freshly washed windows onto the polished wooden floors. "Tomorrow," Quincy said softly, his arm around her waist, "tomorrow this becomes our home." "It already feels like home," Tessa replied, leaning against his solid strength, "because you're here." Their wedding day dawned clear and mild, the sky a perfect blue that matched Quincy's eyes and the sapphire on Tessa's finger. At the Wilsons' home, friends and neighbors gathered in the garden, where white chairs had been arranged in neat rows and an arch of early spring flowers marked the spot where the couple would exchange their vows. In the guest bedroom that had once been hers, Tessa prepared with Margaret's help, donning the ivory silk gown that represented both her professional skill and her personal joy. Her copper hair was arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck, adorned with tiny white flowers and a simple veil of Brussels lace. "You look radiant," Margaret said, adjusting the veil with careful hands. "Absolutely radiant." A knock at the door announced Thomas, ready to escort his niece down the makeshift aisle in place of her father. "It's time," he said, offering his arm with a proud smile. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion for Tessa, the faces of friends and neighbors, the scent of spring flowers, the sound of a violin playing softly in the background. But Quincy's face as she approached him, his expression of wonder and love, remained crystal clear in her memory. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, their voices steady as they promised to love and cherish one another for all their days. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Quincy's kiss was tender yet passionate, a perfect balance that seemed to symbolize their relationship. The celebration that followed was joyous, a feast prepared by the ladies of the church, music provided by local musicians, dancing that continued until twilight descended over Helena. When it was time for the newlyweds to depart, they were showered with flower petals and good wishes as they climbed into the buggy that would take them to their new home. "Happy, Mrs. Porter?" Quincy asked as they drove through the streets, his arm securely around her shoulders. "More than I can express," Tessa replied, leaning into his embrace. "And you, Mr. Porter, complete," he said simply, the single word conveying everything he felt. Their arrival at their house was met with a surprise. The front porch was illuminated with lanterns, and as Quincy lifted Tessa across the threshold, they discovered that friends had been busy in their absence. Fresh flowers adorned every room, a fire was laid ready in the hearth, and on the kitchen table sat a basket containing a bottle of wine, 2 glasses, and a loaf of fresh bread, traditional symbols of prosperity and joy. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new home, Tessa marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter on a dangerous trail to a lifetime commitment, from strangers to beloved partners, it seemed both miraculous and inevitable. "What are you thinking?" Quincy murmured, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. "About the day we met," Tessa replied, her voice soft in the darkness. "How different my life would have been if you hadn't come along when those riders surrounded my wagon." "Fate," Quincy suggested, pulling her closer against his side, "or Providence?" "Either way, I'm grateful," she said, pressing a kiss to his chest directly over his heart. "So very grateful." Years later, Tessa would look back on that April day as the true beginning of her life, not because she became someone's wife, but because she and Quincy began building something together that was greater than either of them alone could have created. Their home filled with love and eventually with children, first a son with his father's blue eyes and quiet demeanor, then twin daughters who inherited their mother's copper hair and creative spirit. Tessa's dress shop flourished, expanding to include ready-made garments and eventually becoming one of Helena's most respected establishments. Quincy continued his work with the marshal's office, rising to the position of chief deputy, before eventually accepting appointment as territorial judge. Through it all, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and challenges that are part of any life, they remained each other's strength and solace, bound by a love that had begun in danger but blossomed in peace. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and they sat together before the fire, they would remember that fateful day on the Montana Trail when a wagon surrounded by armed riders became the unlikely beginning of their shared story.